Okay, let's, there we go. Which has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's just a cool picture. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to try to wrap up fluid and electrolytes and finish that discussion so we can move on into the immune system. We sort of saved one of the better, more interesting topics for last, since for the past 2 years, we've been all thinking about our immune systems. So let's go ahead. Does anybody have any questions before I start? Okay, then I'm gonna go ahead and open this up. Okay, so this is where we had stopped last week. We were talking about fluid and electrolytes. We had just really gotten into it. And this is a real important point here that if you don't remember, I guarantee you it will come back to haunt you. That and that's called a hint. So the link between all the fluids in the body is the plasma. Because plasma is the source of interstitial fluid, because plasma leaks out of the capillaries and into the interstitial spaces. It is collected by the lymphatic system, returned to the through the lymph nodes back into the plasma. So it goes plasma, interstitial fluid, lymph, plasma. The interstitial fluid surrounds the outside of the cells, and if there is an exchange of water with the cells and with the interstitial fluid, it's going to occur there. So plasma could become intracellular fluid too, if needed. So it is the link. It is the only link that throughout, for all the fluids in our bodies. And the driver for moving this water around is all about osmosis. Remember, in osmosis, the cardinal rule with osmosis is that water moves from high water to low water. We always go from the high water side to the low water side, because high water means that there's low solute. A 90%, a 10% salt solution is 10% salt and 90% water. A 40% salt solution is 40% salt and only 60% water. If you had a membrane between the 10% salt and the 40% salt, water would go from the 10% salt to the 40% salt, because the 10% salt side has got more water. I probably made it more confusing than I needed it to be, but just always look at it from high water to low water. Interstitial fluid moves out, plasma moves out of the capillaries, because there's always greater water concentration in the plasma than there is in the interstitial spaces. There's more salt in the interstitial spaces, so water moves out there. Water moves into the cells if the cells have more solute. Water moves out of the cells if the interstitial fluid has more solute. Water moves back and forth. Remember, our salt levels the actual amount of salt doesn't change too much. It becomes concentrated or dilute depending on how much water is there. The more water you add to an area in the body, like if you're adding more water to the interstitial spaces, you're going to dilute the salt that's already there. If you take away that water, the salt's going to get concentrated. So how much water do we take in? Well, about 2.5 liters a day. The old wives' tale about 8 glasses of water, that means nothing. I mean, how do you know what 8 glasses of water is? How big a glass are we talking about? Are we talking a little glass, a big glass? You know, it never made any sense. Drink 8 glasses of water a day. It's about 2.5 liters is what we need to take in altogether. Now, we don't have to drink 2.5 liters because we get about 30% of that water that we have to take in from our food. Food has a lot of water in it. 30% of the water we take in. We also generate water during cellular respiration. When we go through that whole electron transport stuff, I still trip over that anyway, but when we go through electron transport, we're still making, combining hydrogens and oxygen, we're producing water. So that's another 10%, but the amount of water that we need to actually take in is about 60% of that 2,500 mils. So, you know, about, what, 2 liters, maybe a little bit less than 2 liters. And we do that. We pick it up in our coffee. We pick it up in any, you know, tea and Cokes or whatever. We're picking up the water in there. So we generally don't have a problem with gaining water, you know, replacing the water we lose on a daily basis. So we have to take in about 2,500 mils a day. We're going to lose about 2,500 mils a day. And that's okay, because we're going to stay balanced. We're going to take in 2.5 liters and we're going to lose 2.5 liters over the course of the day. So we stay nice and balanced. We're going to use about 60%. We're going to lose 60% of the water in our bodies through urine, 4% through feces. Feces are about 60 to 70% water. We're going to sweat, and we're going to breathe out a lot of water. We're going to release water through our skin, not perspiration, but we're just going to release water through our skin. So we're going to lose as much as we take in. And it doesn't take very much. This is what's pretty amazing about replacing this water. It doesn't take much of a change in the water level to trigger our thirst response. We get thirsty, not because we don't measure the water levels. We measure our sodium levels. It's a whole lot easier to measure sodium levels than it is to measure water levels. So we measure sodium. If our salt level goes up, that means our water level has dropped. We get saltier, our interstitial fluid or our plasma gets saltier when we lose a little water. Because the salt the actual, you know, I've said this several times, the actual amount of salt in our bodies is pretty constant. It is, oh, well, we have this. Yes.
See, I come on, so. The writing of it's strange.
Yeah, okay, that works. Anyway, so it doesn't matter, you know, it's easier to measure the salt concentration, and that tells us indirectly if our water levels are too high or too low. If we're thirsty, if our salt level rises, then we're going to be thirsty. And it's going to also trigger us to release antidiuretic hormones so we retain water. So now this whole thirst, well, let me show you this first. I get the thirst. Okay. If you're visual, this shows you where it's all gone. You know, bottom line is 2,500 mils of water in, 2,500 mils of water out. We lose about 1.5 liters in our urine, and we replace 1.5 liters in what we drink. So those are the two big ones right there. Foods are about 30% of our water source. We lose water breathing out moisture out of our lungs. It happens. So, but we stay balanced pretty much on a daily basis. So how do we get thirsty? Well, we try to maintain the salt concentration in our bodies of around 300 milliosmoles. 300 milliosmoles. Now, 280 milliosmoles of that is maintained by sodium alone. So sodium's the driver here, and if we get thirsty. If what allows us to get thirsty is if our plasma level drops a little bit by about 10%. That raises the sodium concentration because we're losing. If we lose water, sodium goes up. Because we don't lose sodium, the concentration of sodium in our plasma only goes up 1 to 2%. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. And we also mess around with, if we have angiotensin and aldosterone, aldosterone tells us to retain sodium. So we have to retain water to match the sodium. Because if our sodium levels if we're retaining sodium, we're going to get thirsty. So if our osmolality rises, if our salt concentration goes up, it usually means our water level has dropped, and that makes us thirsty. We only require a 1%. This is the important part of this. It only requires a 1% increase in salt concentration to make us thirsty. And so we're thirsty, and we start retaining water in our kidneys. Just a 1% drop in a 1% rise in sodium means that we've had a drop in water. So we get thirsty and we start retaining water. If our salt concentration goes down, if it becomes diluted, it means we've got too much water. You chug a bottle of water, where's that? Well, remember, where does everything go? It ends up in your plasma. Everything we eat and drink ends up in our plasma. So if you chug a bottle of water, you're going to dilute your plasma. And you're going to dilute the interstitial fluid, and you're going to dilute your lymphatic fluid, and you're going to dilute your urine a little bit. So you're not going to be thirsty, at least you shouldn't be, and you're going to inhibit ADH release. It isn't just alcohol that inhibits ADH, it's water. Too much water tells us, oh, well, we got to pee to get rid of it. And so that's what it does. So we alter our water levels. We either retain water or we get rid of water to keep our salt level constant. The solute doesn't leave. The amount of salt that we have is constant. If we increase the water level, the salt concentration, the percent drops because there's more water. If we lose water, the percent increases because there's less water. Hope everybody's clear in that. Let me go back to my magic beaker again. If I have a beaker of water, a liter of water in a very big beaker, and 100 grams of salt, I have a 10% salt solution. If I let that water evaporate down to 500 mils, half of it now, I haven't lost any of the salt. I've only lost half the water. My salt concentration is now 20%. There's less water. Salt hasn't gone anywhere. We now have a 20% salt solution. Haven't done a thing to it except let the water leave. On the other hand, if I take that same 100 grams of salt in a liter of water and I add a second liter of water to that, I said it was a magic beaker, so it hold anything. My salt concentration is no longer 10% because I have 100 grams in a liter. Now I have 100 grams in 2 liters. And that means it's a 5% solution. I haven't done anything to the amount of salt I started with. I've just changed the water levels. So if our water goes up in our bodies, our salt gets dilute. If our water level goes down, our salt gets concentrated. And neither one of them is an ideal situation. We would no more do ourselves a body a favor by chugging 6 liters of water than by not drinking any water all day. Neither one of those are good things. So the solutes aren't going to move. It's the water that's moving back and forth. So now, come on. I don't want to draw pictures. There we go. Okay. So now we also play a little game with our thirst receptors. because you're thirsty. So you drink it, you get your bottle of water or your Coke or whatever your favorite beverage is and start chugging it down, and you're not thirsty anymore. Well, what happens though is that, let me go back here. What happens is it takes about a half an hour to get that water into our plasma and alter our salt concentration. What really happens when we do this is we detect that the back of our mouth and throat are now moist. They're wet. Whatever we're drinking has, the mucus layer is all wet. And we stretch the mouth, we stretch the esophagus, we stretch our stomach. And that reports to our central nervous system and says, hey, we're stretching because we've got fluids and the back of our throat is moist. We must not be thirsty anymore. So because we're instantly, our thirst is instantly quenched when we start drinking something. We feel good. Yet it still takes a half an hour for that water to work its way into the plasma and go ahead and dilute the salt concentration that was triggering the thirst to begin with. So, but it works. It works every time. Now we discover that you know, when you're really thirsty, you know, what's your favorite drink to quench your thirst with? Water.
Room temperature water.
Okay.
Ice cold water.
Ice cold water, yeah. Despite the fact that, you know, a cold soft drink like a Coke is really tasty, because of all the sugar content in there, it doesn't really quench your thirst. You know, the sugar and all the acids that are in there, because all your soft drinks are going to have high levels of carbonic acid in there, because you carbonate the water. You're adding carbon dioxide in there, and you have phosphoric acid to help get the high fructose corn syrup to go into solution. It doesn't help. Water, you know, water is the ideal thirst quencher. So we pour water down our mouth, down our throat. We moisten the throat. We stretch the stomach, and our brain thinks that, hey, we're not salty anymore. We're not thirsty, even though we still haven't got there yet. Well, apparently we're going to. So some of these terms here might be confusing. The obligatory water losses, it isn't just sweating. This is the water losses that we lose. Perspiration is one of them, these insensible water losses. We have no control over this. We lose it through our feces. We lose it through breathing out. This is the water that has formed, you know, at the level of the mitochondria. This is water that's just evaporating off our skin, not sweat, not perspiring, but just water leaving the skin. And that amounts to about 30% or so of what we lose. And then of course we lose 1.5 liters in urine. So altogether it's about 2.5 liters on an average basis. But you know, the more we exercise, the more we take in, the more we're going to lose. But the average number is about 2.5 liters in, 2.5 liters out. We know that antidiuretic hormone plays a big role in regulating our water levels. Antidiuretic hormone acts on the collecting duct. That's the only place that it will act, other than being a vasoconstrictor. But it will, as far as retaining water, ADH only works in the collecting duct. And if our ADH levels are non-existent, no antidiuretic hormone means that we pee a lot. Remember, antidiuretic. So a diuretic is something that makes you pee. An antidiuretic hormone prevents that. Well, if the ADH isn't there, then you're going to pee, and you're going to pee a lot. The more water you drink, the more you're going to pee. The more other drinks you have, you're going to pee. It's all about the fluid levels in there. And the more water we drink, the more likely we are to inhibit the release of ADH. And yeah, we know alcohol inhibits it, but water does too. If you were to drink 6 bottles of water, you would very likely have to pee quite frequently because you're inhibiting the release of ADH. So, and the trigger there is going to be, with alcohol, we know we inhibit the release of the posterior pituitary, but with excess water, it's because we've diluted the salt concentration. Dilute salt says, hey, we got too much water, we need to pee it away. One of the big problems we encounter with water loss is dehydration. Dehydration is when you're losing more water than you're taking in. It's a very simple definition. There's lots of causes of it. People that are bleeding out are becoming dehydrated. Of course, at that point, we're not really concerned too much about, oh, by the way, you're losing blood through an arterial bleed. And by the way, you're getting dehydrated too. Not high on the list of things to worry about right there. But blood loss, chronic blood loss, burns. Your burn patients, you're burned down to the bone. It looks like barbecue because you burn to the bone. You've destroyed the tissue. The vessels are weeping fluid because they're so damaged. There's no way to control the water loss. And severe burn patients have a real problem with fluid loss and bacterial growth because they're providing a warm, dark, moist environment for bacteria to grow. And the water's coming out as fast as it's going in. A person who has been vomiting or has diarrhea, large bouts of this, maybe exposure to food poisoning, staphylococcal food poisoning is a very nasty food poisoning. It's unpleasant. It usually doesn't kill a lot of people. It kills some people, but not very many. Most of the times if you've had staphylococcal food poisoning, you've spent it wrapped around the toilet because you feel feverish and achy and you are nauseated, and it's just easier to sleep in the floor by the toilet. Trust me, I've been there twice, and it's very unpleasant, and then it goes away. As fast as it came on, it goes away, usually about 24 hours. But you have become massively dehydrated at that point. Person who works outside on a very, very hot day and is sweating and not recovering it, not drinking anything, can become dehydrated. Someone who is deprived of water, or for whatever reason, and you got people that are taking diuretics because they want to lose weight. So these can all cause dehydration. Now, one of the signs of dehydration is what we call tenting of the skin. If you pull your skin up and it stays up, it means that your patient is dehydrated. It doesn't go down easily, because if you pull it up and it doesn't go, it just stays up there. Just like the opposite with edema, with overhydration, if you press against the skin and you leave a dimple, the dimple will stay there because they've got too much water in the skin. So what will happen when they're dehydrated, their skin will be dry. The thing is, yes, we can survive for 3 days without water, but by the 3rd day, we are having some sort of psychological breakdown and we can't find water. So we really only have about a day. If we are in a situation where we don't have any water, we've got about a day to find water. We can go for a whole month without food, but only about 3 days without water. Anyway, dehydration. Now, when we become dehydrated, the cells are going to respond. The first place we see the water loss is going to be in the interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid is going to lose water, which means the salt concentration is going to go up. So the cells are going to respond by sending their water out the intracellular water is going to leave the cells and go to the interstitial fluid to try and compensate for the loss of water. So we're losing water from the interstitial fluid. And so our cells respond by sending water out. And so the rise in the salt concentration in the interstitial fluid, or as they say, the extracellular fluid, causes the cells to release water. Okay, so we release water to dilute the salt and try to reach homeostasis. And the cells are going to shrink. Cells don't like to shrink. They don't like to shrink at all, because when they shrink, they don't work as well. And so your cells are going to start shrinking as they send water out. Brain cells don't like to shrink at all. Red blood cells can shrink. They don't like it, but they can do it. They start losing function with, like neurons do not like to shrink, whatever. And as they start losing water, then we start running into some serious problems, which is why after about 2 days of no water, we start having these psychological and psychotic issues with our brain. Now, on the other hand, yes, we can become dehydrated. On the other hand, though, we have what's known as hypotonic hydration. Now, remember what the term hypotonic means. You have isotonic, meaning that salt concentrations are balanced between the inside and the outside of the cell. Hypertonic means that you have higher salt outside than inside the cell. And hypotonic means you have less salt outside than inside. Hypotonic hydration means that you've got excessive amounts of water going into the plasma. You lose a bet and you have to drink 6 liters of water in 2 minutes. I don't know what kind of bet you had, but you lose a bet. You have to drink all this water. Now, what will happen is that the individual that drinks a lot of water real fast will become overhydrated. The term is actually water intoxication. We dilute the interstitial fluid, we lower the salt concentration because we've added a whole bunch more water here. That's a technical term, whole bunch more. So a lot of water, we've diluted this. Someone who's running a marathon, at the end of the marathon, chugs down 6 liters of water, they're going to put themselves in a condition known as Hyponatremia. They don't have enough salt in their interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid has been super diluted. Salt content, the actual amount of salt is always the same, but the percentage is now diluted because you've added all this extra water here. Well, now all of a sudden, instead of being in balance with the water level inside the cell, you've got much higher water levels on the outside. That water goes into the cells. You've diluted the salt in the interstitial fluid. That's the hypo. Remember, when something is hypo, it is becoming less. You have hyponatremia. You have lowered the salt level, which means your water levels are much higher. Now, instead of the cells of the body shrinking, they're going to start expanding as water moves into them. So hypotonic hydration, excessive water loading into the cells.
So without salt, our cells would swell way too large, and with too much salt,
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Too much salt, they shrink. Too little salt, they expand. Because the salt is the solute. It is the driver for which way the water is going to go. The more water you add to the outside, you're either going to dilute that salt and make it, the percent's going to drop. The amount's still the same, but the percent's going to drop. Or you take the water away, the percent's going to go up.
Okay, so I had an uncle who worked construction when I was little, and he used to always, while he was working, he would take ice and he would pour salt on his ice, and he would eat these salted ice chips because he would claim he was replacing the salt in his body. from where he was sweating so much outside all the time. Is
That's
that real, or was that a wrong belief of his?
well, you know, it helps the benefit it had to the ice was it made the ice colder, and that would give some relief. There's a real popular belief that we lose a lot of salt when we perspire heavily, and we do lose some salt. You know, in strenuous activity on a hot day, we do lose. I guess that's dues. A little salt in there, but you know, taking salt like that, or taking salt pills, you know, or even like the electrolyte replacement drinks like Gatorade, you know, the amount of salt that you lose, I just don't think that you can, you're replacing some, but you're not losing enough to make a significant difference. It's the water that's more important on a hot day than anything else, because we're going to try to retain as much sodium as we can. Now, infants are different. You know, they lose it when they've got diarrhea, they've got vomiting, they're losing their electrolytes there. So they need, you know, they're smaller. They got to take care of that. But the average human, it's more about the loss of, you know, water than anything else now. So, I mean, if it helped him because he was getting his water through his ice, you know, and if he was losing a little salt, it probably helped that little bit he was losing. So, okay. So here we have hypotonic hydration. If we are overhydrated, we perhaps our kidneys aren't retaining a lot of water. Perhaps we are taking too much water coming in. We're intoxicated. We have too much water enters the interstitial fluid. We dilute the interstitial fluid. The salt percent, the osmotic concentration drops. Water starts moving into the cells by osmosis. The cells are going to swell up. Red blood cells will pop. They will rupture if they swell up too much. You know, we don't like our red blood cells to do that. We don't like, our neurons do not like to swell in our brain. They hate that. And so your patient can die just as easily from intoxication, water intoxication, than they can by dehydration. So, because their neurons can swell up. You can start triggering arrhythmias in the heart as the neurons are swelling, and they can die. So, and it happens. People die from drinking too much water. It sounds ridiculous, but it happens. People die from drinking too much water. Now here's something that you will encounter likely. You're probably not going to see a lot of examples of water intoxication. You know, you might see something like that. You know, if you're at a marathon, for example, somebody's running 26 miles and they haven't been drinking, and then they get to the end of the race and they drink a lot of water because they're really thirsty. Well, what they've done is they've diluted all the salt they've got, and they throw themselves into hyponatremia. Now they've got cramps and disorientation and swelling of brain cells, and you know, all sorts of bad things are happening. So your average marathoner will drink water constantly as they run through the race. There's water stations all across the marathon route. If you've ever seen them on TV, if you ever run a marathon, you know, they grab a cup of water, drink a little bit, throw it on themselves, throw the cup down, and keep on going. You know, they don't stop to chug down a whole liter, just enough to keep them dehydrated, you know, without overdoing it. Edema occurs when it doesn't have to deal with taking in too much water. It has to deal with retention of fluids. You know, right side of the heart's not keeping up with the left side, or the left side's not keeping up with the right side. You're retaining fluids. Your blood pressure has gone up. Your capillaries are more permeable. your patient has heart failure. You know, remember, if the right side of the body isn't keeping, right side of the heart's not keeping up with the left side, you're going to accumulate fluid in the tissues, in the interstitial spaces. Because, you know, if you're putting out 70 mils into the systemic circulation and 70 mils is coming back, and you're only sending 50 mils to the lungs, that 20 mils at every contraction, it was, you know, it's being retained in the tissues. So your patient develops systemic edema. Their arms and legs are swelling up, their abdomen's swelling up. If the left side's not keeping up with the right side, you know, the left side sending out 50 mils, but it's the right side sending 70 to the lungs and 70 comes back to the left side. The left side's only sending out 50. What happens to the other 20 mils? It backs up in the lungs. You have pulmonary edema. So all, you know, swelling in the tissues. And one of the classic signs is this dimpling effect here. You press down on the skin, you can leave fingerprints behind, you can see dimples in here, and it takes a while to come up. It's not like you just push down and it bounces back up. So this takes a while.
Right side heart failure, the symptoms line up with the word swelling, and then left side, it's drowning,
Yeah.
the symptoms of it. Okay. I know I knew that, I just want to make sure that I had.
Okay. Now, other types of water loss. Well, we know, we've talked about this a long time ago. Diabetes insipidus, not mellitus, but insipidus. Usually caused by a tumor on the posterior pituitary not releasing antidiuretic hormone. It's not a malignancy. It has nothing to do with glucose levels, but your patient's thirsty all the time because they're peeing all the time, and they're peeing all the time because there's no antidiuretic hormone. And so they pee and they pee and they pee and they're thirsty and they're thirsty and they're thirsty because they're not regulating this. There's no, the ADH isn't coming out. And it is, you know, most of your patients that have this are going to, they're going to use the term annoying, you know, to describe it, you know, uncomfortable. You know, it is, as long as your patient stays hydrated, it's not life-threatening. And depending on what's causing it, it can be treated too, but it has nothing to do with glucose levels. The big giveaway, of course, you know, they're peeing like crazy and they're thirsty all the time. Like crazy is another technical term, by the way. I'm full of it today, so I'll just let it go with that. Those are two of the cardinal symptoms of diabetes mellitus, but the third one isn't there. They're not hungry. They're eating normally. Their blood glucose levels are normal. They only have two of the three signs. They're peeing and they're thirsty. They're thirsty because they're peeing all the time. They're peeing all the time because there's no ADH there. Nothing to do with glucose levels or insulin. Everything else is fine. So, not unusual, not frequent, but it's not unusual to have insipidus or to have a patient with insipidus, you know. Now here's why. This is probably the best animation I've ever seen to explain why your patient with diabetes mellitus pees all the time. So here we have on the right-hand side, we have the filtrate. We have the proximal tubule. It's full of water, it's full of salt, it's full of glucose, because your patient with diabetes mellitus has lots of glucose in their plasma. Now the filtrate was plasma up until it went through the glomerulus. Everybody. So that's, you know, that's where it was. The glucose that's in the filtrate was small enough to pass right through the glomerulus. We do that all the time, but then we recover the glucose back into the peritubular capillary. See, look over there on the capillary. That's the red thing. The plasma has glucose in it, like it's supposed to. Well, the problem is that there's so much glucose in the filtrate. And the tubule, proximal tubule and the paratubular capillary are side by side. Water is going to leave the paratubular capillary and go into the tubule by osmosis simply because of all that glucose that's present in there. We're not getting the glucose back into the cells like we should. The insulin's not working. That's why the glucose level is so high in the filtrate. And that draws the water out of the capillary. And so we have extra water in there. Your patient's urine is going to be have high levels of glucose, and it's going to have a lot of water. So all that water makes you pee, simply because there's a lot of glucose in there. That's why we have that. One of the cardinal signs of diabetes mellitus is constant urination. Because all the glucose that's not going into the cells. Remember what diabetes mellitus does. It doesn't allow you to, it either doesn't recognize the glucose, the insulin. You know, the cells don't recognize the insulin and open up carrier proteins for the glucose to come in, or they're not making enough insulin. Those are the two types, diabetes 1 and 2. You know, type 1 diabetes, you're not making insulin, so you can't make the carrier proteins. Type 2, the insulin you're making isn't being recognized. In either case, you're not getting the glucose into the cells. Where does that glucose stay? It stays in the plasma. When that plasma gets filtered through the glomerulus, it's packed full of glucose. The glucose that would have gone into the cells. And that draws the water out of the capillaries around the proximal tubule, and your water level goes way up. And so you have to pee. So this is, it's not a very sophisticated animation, but to me, it's one of the best ways to explain why your patient's always thirsty and always has to pee. They're always thirsty because they're peeing. They're always peeing because they've got lots of water in their filtrate, and the filtrate contains lots of glucose. There should be no glucose in the filtrate after you get past the proximal tubule. We should have gotten all the glucose out of the proximal tubule. Glucose is small enough to go through the glomerulus. We should have gotten rid of it. So that's why we pee. Okay. Now, a few factoids about sodium. 95% of all the solutes in the plasma and the interstitial fluid is from sodium. Of the 300 milliosmoles that we like to stay when we're in balance with our solute concentration, 280 milliosmoles of that comes from sodium. The rest of them are just sort of watching, the last 10% or so, or 20%. So it is the single most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid. It's the only one that causes osmosis to occur. So sodium's the driver. Sodium is always the driver. And the content, in a healthy individual, the amount of sodium in the extracellular fluid stays constant, because we can adjust the water levels to keep the sodium levels, the percent constant. We don't lose a whole lot of sodium. We don't gain a whole lot of sodium. So now, something you remember what happens with aldosterone. Aldosterone tells us to retain sodium. Aldosterone tells the kidneys to retain sodium, and to retain sodium, you got to get rid of something else. Let me go back here one slide. There we go. Now, if we're going to retain sodium, then we're going to have to get rid of potassium. That's just the way we have to stay balanced. So if we retain sodium, we're getting rid of potassium. If we retain potassium, we got to get rid of the sodium, because sometimes we want to keep the potassium. So here we have it, the outside of a cell with water and sodium on the outside, because sodium's in the extracellular fluid. It's the number one ion outside the cell. Number one ion inside the cell is potassium. We've been hearing that since AP1 days with muscles. So we got potassium inside the cell and sodium outside. If we are going to retain sodium, we've got to get rid of potassium. If we get rid of sodium, then we retain the potassium. If we get rid of potassium, whatever. I've said it. I don't want to confuse it. So, okay. So here's what's going to happen. If we start losing the sodium, we're going to lose water from the cell. If we start losing, let me get back and do it again. If aldosterone is kicking out the potassium, what's going to happen to the cells? It's going to lose water because you're losing the solutes inside the cell. So aldosterone, yes, aldosterone's retaining sodium. We got to get rid of potassium. The potassium is coming from inside the cells. The cells that are giving out the potassium are going to lose water. Oops, didn't help. Here we go. Let's do it. There we go. So we're losing our potassium, and we will see water leaving the cell. If we drop sodium, then water goes into the cell. If we get rid of sodium, water goes into the cell because now the interstitial fluid is going to be more dilute. Sodium and potassium have this little dance where they try to stay in balance with each other. Sodium goes down, potassium goes up. Potassium goes down, sodium goes up. Remember, again, what happens with aldosterone? It tells the kidneys to kick out potassium at the distal tubule. We secrete potassium at the distal tubule. We retain sodium so we can retain water, so we can raise our blood volume and raise our blood pressure. Okay. I just said that. If our sodium levels change, we can, if we retain sodium, if we're retaining more sodium, we will retain more water. That will raise our plasma levels. It will raise our blood pressure. More fluid in the plasma means our heart has to work harder. Blood pressure goes up. The amount of water in the interstitial fluid goes up because that water is going to leak out of the plasma. So it's all about sodium. Sodium levels are going to determine plasma levels, blood pressure, interstitial fluid. I mean, think about this for a second. What do we tell patients with hypertension not to eat a lot of? Salt. Because salt causes them to, when they eat salt, they retain water. So they retain water when they're eating salt. And that raises their blood volume. That raises their blood pressure. So maybe eating the ice with the salt on it may have caused them to retain more water too. Could be. So there's probably a degree of truth in that statement. So small grain, but you know.
I just never understood that like gargling with salt water and cure a sore throat. I can understand that. That's just like eating salt and ice.
Yeah,
well, drink salt water.
Yeah. You know, we don't like to drink salt water because it's not it can disrupt everything.
Isn't it better for you to like just thirst if you're stranded in the ocean than it is to drink ocean
Oh yeah,
water?
drinking salt water in the ocean is not a good way to survive, you know. So now, where do we recover our salt? Well, I've said this before. Most of it's in the proximal tubule. By the time we get down to the end of the loop of Henle, we've recovered 90% of all the salt. The last 10% we recover is in the distal tubule thanks to aldosterone, and only if aldosterone is present. But water will always follow salt if it can. So the more salt you recover, the more salt you take in, the more fluid volume you're going to increase. Okay. And I've said this already about aldosterone. Renin-angiotensin triggers angiotensin 2 to trigger the release of aldosterone. And aldosterone tells us to retain sodium, to retain water, to raise blood pressure, but it is not a rapid process. The kidneys don't do anything rapidly. Kidneys do everything slowly. If you are trying to raise blood pressure, you're going to do a better job with vasoconstricting through the arterioles with norepinephrine. But the kidneys will also respond by releasing aldosterone. Well, first of all, they'll release angiotensin 2, which is a vasoconstrictor, and then they're going to release aldosterone, which is going to tell us to retain sodium at the distal tubule, retain water, and then we raise our blood volume, raising our blood pressure. But that's not an immediate fix. That's a slow fix. It takes time. The kidneys respond to things like this in days, not hours or minutes or seconds. So, it takes a couple days for the kidneys to get around to seeing a rise in blood pressure here, thanks to aldosterone. Okay. Problems with sodium. We've already mentioned one of them, hyponatremia. Blood levels of sodium are low. Simply, one of the classic examples is taking in too much water too rapidly. If we drink a lot of water, our cells can rupture. They can undergo lysis. They can swell and pop like a balloon. A tremendous amount of sweating, vomiting or diarrhea can cause sodium loss. But just working outside on a hot day, sweating and not replacing waters is not going to, push you into hyponatremia. The average, cutting your grass on a hot day will make you thirsty, but it's probably not going to, unless a normal healthy individual should not be sliding into hyponatremia here because they've lost so much water or they've lost a lot of salt. You shouldn't be losing a lot of salt here. Now, that's hyponatremia. Hypernatremia, the sodium levels are very high. Hypernatremia, you don't have a lot of water. You are retaining, you are losing lots of water. Your salt levels go way up. Hypernatremia, high blood sodium. The cells are going to shrink. High blood sodium levels. You're losing water from the plasma. You can't control the need to urinate. So maybe your diabetes insipidus patient is losing so much water and not replacing it, that their salt levels are going to go up. Which is still, anything, again, not a good thing. So, hypernatremia, water deficit is usually the trigger. Water deficit is the trigger, not drinking enough water. Now, infants, small body size, small circulatory system, they are very susceptible to hypernatremia if they're losing lots of fluids, losing a lot of water. They're very susceptible to this. This is the area where whether you're losing water or losing electrolytes, that you have to be very careful with. This is where these electrolyte additives like Pedialyte can really be helpful. So. So this is a good summary slide right here for hyponatremia, loss of sodium or excess water, either taking in too much water or the kidneys are retaining too much water. Your patient isn't thirsty, They are peeing all the time because ADH isn't there to prevent it. They're peeing a lot and they're not taking water in. Hyponatremia. Yeah. Again, think of your marathoner that chugs down 6 liters of water at the end of the race. So, hypotonic hydration, taking in too much water. Now, our cardiovascular system can detect a problem with the blood volume. Our baroreceptors in the aortic arch and the carotid sinus will tell us that our volume is up because, indirectly, because the blood pressure is up. If our blood pressure is up, our blood volume is maybe behind that. So the sympathetic nervous system may start telling the kidneys, stop with the aldosterone, stop retaining sodium, stop retaining water. They may start lowering the pressure of filtration. They may dilate the afferent arteriole. Remember, the afferent arteriole leading into the glomerulus can either be dilated or constricted. We can lower the pressure in the kidneys if it dilates, lowering the filtration rate. We can constrict it if we want to increase the pressure. So if our pressure's up, we can dilate the afferent arteriole so that we filter at a better rate. Because remember, if we're shooting blood into the kidneys under high pressure, we're not going to have time to filter anything. So if our blood volume is up too high, we're going to start, if our kidneys are functioning properly, if our blood volume is up too high, the pressure receptors are going to detect that as increased blood pressure, and they're going to tell our kidneys to increase the filtration rate and get rid of more sodium and get rid of more water. A healthy individual will do this if we have if we have a drastic increase in blood volume. So ANP also plays a role here too. Good old ANP. ANP will tell will block the formation of aldosterone. The atria get stretched. The atria don't like to stretch more than they're supposed to. We will get rid of we will get rid of more water and get rid of sodium. We will not make any aldosterone, and we will stop producing angiotensin II, which is a vasoconstrictor, which raises the pressure. So we're going to control our fluid. We control our fluid levels in a couple different ways. We control it at the kidneys. We control it at the heart with the ANP. The sympathetic nervous system helps to control by either not generating aldosterone all by itself or controlling it by making aldosterone. Okay, so now, so let's talk about potassium. We know, so that's sodium. What do you got to remember about sodium? Hyponatremia, hypernatremia. Hypo, not enough salt, usually causes too much water. Hypernatremia, too much salt because there's less water. Both of those are unpleasant conditions. Now, what about potassium? Potassium is the cation that's inside all the cells. It is sort of the counterpart to sodium. It's also a positively charged ion. It is the #1 ion inside all the cells. Between sodium and potassium, we have our charge on the membrane. Two conditions that can occur: Hypokalemia, we call it the old Latin term for potassium. We have Hypokalemia or Hyperkalemia. A patient that has been vomiting a lot or experiencing diarrhea a lot, or have moved into a state of alkalosis where their blood pH is climbing above 7.4. They're becoming more alkaline. Tend to be in a hypokalemic state. the more vomiting and diarrhea your patient has, the more potassium they're going to lose. If they are in an alkaline state, they're going to be losing potassium. Hyperkalemia, we are retaining lots of potassium. Too much potassium drives our muscle cells to a hyperpolarized state. It's harder to generate an action potential in the muscle cell. The muscle cell, to get those muscle cells to do something, requires a stronger than normal threshold is still minus 55 in a muscle cell, but if we are hyperpolarized, it takes more effort to get that muscle to contract. And when the muscle contracts, it may not let go again. So our muscle cells may become overly excited. The heart is very sensitive to potassium. The heart is very, very sensitive to potassium. Too much potassium in the heart stops the heart. So we don't like to have a lot of potassium affecting the heart. A patient that is hyperkalemic is going to be confused. They're going to have difficulty moving their muscles. They're going to have difficulty breathing. So there's a lot of bad things that happen with too much potassium.
Is that where like muscle cramps come from? Is too much potassium in your muscle cells? Or like in your like Charlie horses and stuff like that?
It's usually because there's not enough.
Not enough.
Not enough. The cramps usually are caused by a hypokalemic state. And you can get rid of the cramps by eating something with potassium, like bananas. You know,
Yeah, the kids.
banana chips, or I even had discovered that mustard, a tablespoon of mustard has enough potassium in it to start reestablishing the balance in there, which sounds really bizarre, but I had a number of soccer players a couple of years ago swear by it, and they say it works. So there's probably lots of potassium inside mustard. But I know that, the average, you get some cramps, eat a banana, eat banana chips, something like that to load up again. So it's more of a caused by a lack of potassium.
But why do they, when I was pregnant, I had bad muscle, whatever, leg cramps, and they told me to drink Gatorade.
Gatorade's potassium's in there.
Okay.
So yeah, it isn't just salt, it isn't just orange flavored salt water. They throw other electrolytes in there too. So, so the potassium is, yeah, I know. You can't, there is no way to make Gatorade really tasty, no matter how cold it is or how much ice is in there or whatever you add to it, it just doesn't taste like, Okay, now hyperkalemia, you have too much potassium in the extracellular fluid. You have too much potassium outside the cell. You are driving the charge in the membrane, you're hyperpolarizing the membrane. Remember, if there's lots of potassium outside the cell, it's going to be awful hard for potassium to leave the cell. You're trying to repolarize a muscle cell and you've got lots of potassium outside. It's going to be hard for that potassium to want to leave the cell and move out. The reason that cells repolarize is because there's less potassium outside than there is inside, so as potassium leaves. But if you got lots of potassium outside the cell, I'm not going out there. It's going to stay inside. So it's harder to repolarize. You get a contraction and you can't get another contraction. The muscle cell doesn't respond, neither does the neuron. If you're hypokalemic, then you become non-responsive. If you're hyperkalemic, you end up contracted. You become you have a depolarization, and then you don't have anything else. So in both cases, we don't get our contractions like we want. Hyperkalemia or hypokalemia. If there's not enough potassium, if there's too much potassium outside the cell, you're not going to be able to repolarize. If there's too little potassium, you're going to repolarize, and then you're not going to be able to contract again. In either case, too little or too much potassium is not a good thing. And it interferes particularly with the conduction of the skeletal, of the cardiac muscles in the heart. Lots of people have died because of potassium irregularities in their blood. And if you were of a nature to want to get rid of somebody, a quick injection of potassium is, how they do it. So just, yeah. Why are you writing it all down like that?
Adding it to my list. For the moment, I decided to
Okay.
tackle it.
But now potassium does something else for us too. It's part of our buffering system. The buffering system regulates our pH levels. We don't want to get too acidic or too basic. Remember, normal blood is at 7.4 pH, slightly alkaline because we're always pulling in all that CO2 to make carbonic acid. So the terms here, acidosis and alkalosis, come into play. Acidosis is when we are moving below 7.4. Alkalosis is when we're moving above 7.4. Both of these levels are going to interfere with normal nerve and muscle cell activity. If we are in an acidotic state, if we are getting more and more acidic, then our potassium levels are going to go up. If our potassium levels go up, then we've got the whole issue with how do we depolarize, how do we repolarize again? So because we're sending a lot of potassium out into the interstitial fluid. If we become alkaline, then the potassium levels in the fluid outside the cells drop. And again, we interfere with the ability to depolarize and repolarize. So we can't get our neurons to do what we want them to do. We can't get our muscle cells. So it isn't just about ions. Now it's about dealing with pH. I guess it's still about ions too. So
I can see me telling the law. Also, I was just trying to keep this pH balance.
yeah, so you're trying to keep the pH balance. Oh, I forgot all about the potassium. They're not responsive now. So okay, so now. Potassium balance. The most important thing with potassium is its concentration in the interstitial fluid outside the cells, because that's going to dictate the whole situation of repolarization and or depolarization. So the concentration in the extracellular, it's usually, in all these cases here, it's usually one or the other. And here it has to deal with the concentration in the extracellular fluid and the interstitial fluid. If you have a patient that eats a lot of potassium in their diet, they're on the banana diet, the banana chip diet, the bananas, whatever, bananas Foster, whatever that is. And I think I had it once. I don't remember anything about it. High levels of potassium in your diet lead to high levels of potassium in the extracellular fluid. Who would eat a lot of potassium unwittingly? Salt substitutes contain potassium chloride, Mrs. Dash, whatever that stuff is.
Are there no salt?
Yeah, the no salt, the salt substitutes are based on potassium. And a lot of people that have issues with salt also have issues with flavor and taste and odor. So they're going to be loading up with those salt substitutes with all that potassium. That's going to raise the level of the potassium in their extracellular fluid and then start interfering with muscle and nerve contractions. If you have a patient that has low potassium in their interstitial fluid, then they're going to not be able to, again, potassium will leave the cells, but not want to come back in. So again, you're going to run into the whole issue of depolarization and repolarization. We have to maintain that nice balance in here with potassium. So the number one thing about potassium is the extracellular fluid concentration. Too much, too little. Both of those are bad. So aldosterone now sticks its ugly head in here too, because aldosterone tells us to get rid of potassium. Well, on a short-term basis, that's probably not a bad thing, because what we're trying to do, aldosterone's role is not evil. Aldosterone's role is to raise our blood pressure when we need to. By retaining sodium and retaining water, we increase blood volume, we raise blood pressure. But that's not an immediate response. It takes a couple days for that to kick in. But when we retain, if we're retaining sodium at the distal tubule, then we're kicking out potassium, because we can only have so many ions here. Aldosterone tells us to kick out potassium. We also can trigger, and it isn't just the kidneys that can trigger it. The adrenal glands themselves can trigger it. If there's too much potassium already in your plasma. Your patient's been living off of Mrs. Dash and bananas. People do strange things, probably not exaggerating on this. If the potassium level in the interstitial fluid is up, that's going to release aldosterone anyway, despite, the kidneys may not have anything to do with this. Aldosterone's made in the adrenal cortex by the zona glomerulosa. The zona glomerulosa is sensitive to potassium levels. But if potassium levels are up, it may release aldosterone on its own. Forget angiotensin, forget renin, forget all that. Here we're going to release aldosterone to get rid of the excess potassium. And so now we're going to be lowering our potassium levels. Now what's that going to do? Well, we're trying to get back to homeostasis, but how's that going to affect the sodium levels? How's that going to affect anything else? The adrenal cortex is trying to regulate the levels of potassium on their own, but no system works in a vacuum. So are we going to have consequences? Well, we might. The trigger is going to be the excess potassium in your patient. And where did it come from? Because your patients will do strange things, and they truly believe, like most of us do, that there's some is good, more is a lot better, right? And that only works in some things. Okay. Now, here we go. Here are the salt substitutes. They are high in potassium. Now, they're fine as long as the aldosterone levels can regulate them. Good old aldosterone. Now it's our friend. Your patient can't eat salt, so they're eating potassium chloride for flavor, and their aldosterone levels work just fine, and you get rid of that excess potassium. But if the aldosterone isn't working properly, your patient if your patient can't produce aldosterone, they're going to die from their salt substitute. If your patient is using too much potassium, they can slide into hyperkalemia and die very quickly. Well, we found Uncle Fred in the kitchen with Mrs. Dash in his hand and his face down in his meatloaf. Couldn't figure it out. Well, apparently he had an aldosterone issue from his adrenal cortex. So, if you have, on the other hand, if Uncle Fred has a tumor on the cortex, which can happen, now he's pumping out lots of aldosterone. Just the opposite happens. If he's not producing any aldosterone at all, he's going to retain all that potassium and die. On the other hand, if he has a tumor that's pumping out lots of aldosterone, it's going to get rid of all his potassium, and he's going to die. So it doesn't look good for Uncle Fred in either case, because if there's too much aldosterone, all the potassium goes out. He hyperpolarizes. His resting potential isn't -90 in muscle cells anymore. It's like -200. The muscle cell can't respond to any kind of action potential, so they're paralyzed. It's not a good situation here. These salt substitutes work, as long as your patient's healthy. As long as their aldosterone levels are normal. Before your patient goes on any kind of salt substitute, they probably ought to have their aldosterone levels screened in blood workup to make sure that their aldosterone levels are normal. So I get excited about this kind of stuff. So, okay, hyperkalemia, too much potassium. The consequences of hyperkalemia are acidosis. So your patient, on top of everything else, as they're retaining too much potassium, are now driving their blood pH below 7.4. They're retaining hydrogen ions. And one of the first things that you're going to see here is your patient will start breathing faster, because acidity causes us to breathe faster. We don't care what the source is, but the medulla oblongata says, oh, hey, we're acidic. It must be because of CO2. Let's breathe faster. And so we breathe faster. Just like, remember ketoacidosis back in January? I'm sure everybody remembers it. Yeah. Your diabetic patient has ketoacidosis because they're breaking down fats and releasing fatty acids, and it's making your blood pH drop. And the medulla doesn't know what the cause is. All they know is the blood pH is dropping. So the medulla says, let's breathe faster. So your patient shows up with ketoacidosis, rapid breathing, hyperventilating, smelling like, a fruit, some sort of fruit juice, because they're generating ketones, fingernail polish remover, smells pleasant type thing. Okay, because they're in acidosis. Hyperkalemia will also throw your patient into acidosis. Too much potassium will cause them to rapid breathe and start seeing their blood pH dropping. And if we get too low, that also can kill them. So now the other side of this is alkalosis. With alkalosis, we are pulling hydrogens away. So if we have hypokalemia in the plasma, then we drive the other way. We drive towards alkalosis because we're pulling away the hydrogens. Too much potassium in the plasma drives us into acidosis. Too little potassium in the plasma drives us into alkalosis. So on top of everything else with potassium, now we have to pay attention to what's the blood pH of our patient. Now the beauty of that is a quick and dirty, well, not dirty, but a quick blood pH check tells you, are they acidic or are they alkaline? Now, if they're acidic, that leads you down a whole series of pathways to investigate if they're alkaline. You also have to, if you check the sodium and potassium levels, you can start eliminating things. Are they alkaline, but their potassium levels are fine? Okay, so it's not any kind of alkalosis from being hyper or hypokalemic. So there's a whole lot of things you have to check on. But acidosis and alkalosis. Acidosis is hyperkalemic. Alkalosis is hypokalemic. So. And we got another one to pay attention to. Calcium, good old calcium in our bones. We know what calcium does. It allows us to contract our skeletal muscle. Calcium binds to troponin and rolls the tropomyosin out of the way so the myosin heads can reach up and grab the actins and give it a good yank. So calcium is very important to us. Calcium it works as a second messenger in some of the larger hormones for us. Two terms, hypocalcemia, low blood calcium. The thyroid is not functioning properly. Our blood calcium levels, we are stimulating too much bone growth. Calcitonin which normally doesn't really get to do a whole lot, may be very active and stimulate bone growth. That would cause hypocalcemia. Hypercalcemia, where we dissolve a lot of bone, is caused by excessive parathyroid hormone release. So hypocalcemia, hypercalcemia.
Whoever made these words up intended to confuse people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know.
That was their life goal.
We have hypoconfusion and hyperconfusion.
I might be both. I'm just kidding, I don't even know.
Okay. Yeah. You got too wet when you were walking in. That's,
Yeah.
you know,
It's just,
so.
yeah.
We always like to say that calcitonin doesn't have anything to do. It's always about the parathyroid hormone. Calcium levels in the blood get too low, we release parathyroid hormone, we dissolve some bone, we get our calcium back up to where it belongs. We're never going to be up to where we need to be. So the osteoclasts are always going to be breaking down bone for us. Kidneys are always going to be retaining calcium for us. The small intestine is always going to be absorbing calcium for us. So parathyroid hormone is always going to bring the calcium back up to normal. If we have excessive calcium, which we never do, or which we shouldn't have, we're going to release calcitonin to build up more bones. So, okay. Good slide here to remember. Hypocalcemia, not enough calcium leads to tetany. Hypercalcemia may lead to arrhythmias. And since it's 11 o'clock, this is a really good place to stop. Okay. And anybody have any questions? Yes.
So test 4 and 5.
Test 4 opened up today, but we're not ready yet. I'll have to close it back till Wednesday because I thought I was going to get through this today, but I didn't. So, but I'm on, let me see where I am on this.
You're almost there.
I'm almost there. Let me take a look here. Yeah, I'll finish. I only got 25 slides to go. I'll finish that on Wednesday morning, and then we'll be able to go on into respiratory and immune. So it'll open up. I'll push it back a couple days for you. So this section always takes more than I think it will. So, okay.
It's a lot.
Oh, it is. No. Anyway, any questions on anything? Otherwise, I want to get us out of here, and I'll see you all on Wednesday.